welcome back to yet another video. This week I am making two costumes, two very highly recognisable costumes. I'm making an Anna and Elsa costume for my nieces for Christmas. So without any further ado, let me show you how it's done. For this project I'm using a simplicity pattern number 1233. And first let's start with Anna. Fabric wise I have a light blue cotton for her undershirt. This mystery royal blue textured upholstery fabric. A magenta felted wool for the cape, which was a really lucky find because I found it at an end of line sale. Some reddish pinkish satin to line the cape with. A pom-pom trim for the cape. A metallic gold ribbon for the bodice. An Anna and Elsa cotton to use as lining. And finally some leftover black corduroy from my Hobbit costume to use as the bodice. Now before I cut any of the fabrics out for this project, I first designed the embroidery piece that Anna has in the centre of her bodice. I did this using a free program called InkStitch, and yes, this embroidery file will be available for free on my website, look for the link down below. Now the reason I embroidered what would become the centre front bodice piece before cutting it out is because it is so much easier to line up the embroidery with the pattern piece before it is cut out. It's so much easier to hoop it as well, and so that's what you see me doing here. When the embroidery was finished, I could now cut out the pattern piece, making sure to line it up so that the embroidery was directly in the centre front. With the hardest piece to cut out done, I could now move on to cutting out the other fabrics, such as the cotton for the sleeves, the mystery upholstery fabric for the skirt. Now on to assembly. So Anna has a false undershirt layer, which is actually top stitched onto the bodice piece itself. Then I attach the back pieces at the shoulder seams. So I just sewed the first part of the bodice seams together, the two shoulder seams, and I really don't like how they've done this. So they have a little facing bit that goes in the neckline on the front, and then it just cuts off in the shoulder seam, and I think that looks really ugly, so I'm going to cut out some extra bits to go in the back piece so that the facing continues all the way through the back as well, because at the moment, yucky, we don't like. Using one of the back pieces as a template, I trace around it to create what would essentially be the back facings that I'm going to put in the same way I did the front piece. I then cut them out and apply them to the back pieces the same as I did the front. And wow, doesn't that look so much better? And now I've noticed that this part of the neckline looks like it has a faux button lapel bit, sort of like that in it. So I'm just going to take a folded strip of fabric and put a pretend one down the centre, and then put some fancy stitches next to it to mimic what she has. So I take my folded strip of fabric and just tack it in place to the front of the bodice. I then get to use some of the really used fancy stitches on my sewing machine and watch as my sewing machine does hands and foot free sewing. But of course I decided it was much safer to guide the piece with my hands. And here is the result of the fancy stitches. Now it's on to making the collar. First I apply some iron-on interfacing. Then I mark out the seam allowance so I can do some more fancy stitching. Next I sew the front and back pieces of the collar together. Then I clip away the excess fabric in the seam. With the collar turned right side out and pressed, it is now time to sew it into the neckline of the bodice. At this point you may have noticed that I'm yet to sew the side seams together, and that's because I'm about to apply a gold trim along the faux neckline of the bodice, and that was so much easier to do before the side seams get sewn together because the piece can lay out nice and flat. I sewed the gold thread to the top using an invisible thread, which is like a very fine, almost fishing line type of thread, and that's just so that you don't see any top stitching on the gold trim. And now I can finally sew together those side seams. As I've been working on the bodice, I've also been sewing the lining pieces together in the exact same way that the bodice pieces were sewn together. And now it's time to sew that lining to the bodice along the neckline here. And this was actually quite tricky for me because I don't know if you can see there, but I've already pre-trimmed the neckline of the bodice piece, which I shouldn't have done until after I'd sewn the lining in, but oh well, these things happen. Next I moved on to assembling the skirt pieces together. So here I'm sewing the back pieces to the front via the side seams. It was at this point I realised that there was another blue fabric that went along the bottom edge of the skirt, so I just used this other royal blue cotton that I had in my stash and cut out those pieces, sewed them together, and then applied them to the bottom edge of the skirt. And although in the video here I'm applying it to the right side of the under fabric, you're actually meant to sew it to the wrong side of the under fabric, so you can flip it out and it makes a hem along the bottom edge. And that's what I'm doing in the sewing video here, but I just thought I'd address that for you. And then I trimmed the seam using my pinking shears. Right, so here's how the bottom of the skirt is looking. I've just got to iron this so it sits nice and flat and straight. Then I'm going to do a zigzag top stitch along that edge there to hide it. And then I'm going to design the floral embroidery that goes along these parts here and get that done, and then I can attach it to the bodice. As I just mentioned, I'm using a really tight zigzag stitch to create what is called a satin stitching to encase that raw edge along the top of the skirt. Then the skirt gets sewn to the bodice. Next it was time to do the final lot of embroidery along the bottom edge of the skirt, so here I'm marking out little guides using a chalk pen for where to place the embroidered pieces. With all of the embroidery finished, I could now move on to finishing the bodice, which means doing the sleeves. Here I am marking out the seam allowance of the hem of the sleeves, plus an extra 0.5 centimeters so that I have a guideline so I can do some more fancy stitching along the cuff. Then I fold the sleeves in half and stitch down this line here. Next I fold up the hem of the sleeve and iron it in place. I then stitch it in place once again using that invisible thread so that it doesn't cover the nice decorative stitching I've just done. And then they get added to the bodice. Now it's onto the cape, so first I cut out the magenta wool. Next the satin, and finally a purple velvet, which I actually have left over from my own Anna 2 costume, and I use that to make the trim that goes along the cape. Another little pattern annoyance that I have here is that the trim didn't continue onto the under cape either, so I drew it on myself and then using transfer paper I transferred it to the purple velvet, cut it out and applied it to the lower portion of the cape. And using the same satin stitching technique that I used earlier, I stitched the trim in place onto the cape. I did it. All of the pieces now have the trim along it. It took so long. It took hours. But it's done now. Now I can actually put the cape together and be one step closer to finishing this whole thing. Oh my god. Let's go! With all the trim finally applied to the pieces, I now made the overcape. So first I'm sewing these two pieces along these sides here. Then I sew the front and back pieces of the undercape together. Alright, cape pieces are done and put together, but as you can see I have a little bit more decorating to do. So I'm going to do a decorative stitch along this edge here of the undercape, and then add the pom-pom trim to the top one, then assemble the lining in the same way and attach that. So let's get on to that. First I sew on the pom-pom trim to the right side of the fabric. Then I sew on the satin lining. Before I add the lining to the undercape, I'm first doing some decorative stitching along the edge of it. And this took hours to do. I was so over it. Once the machine was finished though, I was then able to add the satin lining to the undercape as well. Next, onto the collar. So I added some scrap black fabric that I had lying around to create the applique that she has on the collar. Once again doing this using that same satin stitching that I've used throughout this costume so far. Then I sew the front and back pieces of the collar together. Then I put all the layers of the cape together and baste them all together. And then doing another stitch to secure them all in place. I then fold the inner portion of the collar over the seam I just created and then stitch it down by hand, thus finishing the cape. And for the final touch on the cape, she has a little heart-shaped closure on the front, so I found this gold one here, which is the wrong colour, so I'm going to use silver nail polish to paint it silver. Once it was dry, I then sewed it to the front of the cape, and the cape is now done. Anna is now completely finished. I'm so happy with how this turned out. It is so cute. And just a heads up for you guys, I will be putting all of the embroidery files that I've made for Anna here up on my website for free, which I will link down below. And this time they will actually be uploaded by the time this video goes up. So yeah, go check them out if you want to make an Anna for one of your little ones in your life. And now that she's done, let's move on to Elsa. First, let's talk about fabrics. So I found this absolutely gorgeous silver blue metallic fabric for the skirt, but did I buy enough of it? Who knows? You'll find out shortly. For the top, I found this ice blue sequin fabric and a blue soft mesh for the rest of the top. Now for the cape, I found this blue organza with silver snowflakes on it, which is actually part of an adult's Elsa costume that I found at the second-hand shop. Now you can see here I've already sacrificed the skirt for another project, but isn't it cool that I got to revamp that? And finally I have the silver rhinestone trim, which I'm going to use for the neckline of the top. First things first, cutting out the fabric, which was actually more of a task than I expected. So I'm using my paper scissors here to cut out the sequins because I didn't want to damage my sewing scissors. And this is just some of the fallout having cut it out, that sequin fabric. I swear I'm going to be finding sequins for months and possibly even years after this project. Next I cut out the mesh for the top portion of the top, followed by the skirt fabric, or what I thought was going to be the only skirt fabric. And finally, the lining fabric, using that same Anna and Elsa cotton that I used for Anna. Okay, so it is cape cutting time, and I don't think I'm going to cut the cape out exactly to the pattern pieces, purely because I don't have the width to cut them out as they are. So what I'm going to do is I just have them laying on top here. I'm going to cut along this edge here so that it'll fit nice into the sleeve edge, and then I'm going to keep the length and the shape of it and just work with that to get it in. I think it will be fine. But yeah, let's cut it out. With all the pattern pieces being cut out, it is now time for assembly. Now there's one fabric I didn't show being cut out here, and that's because I didn't realise I needed it until this moment, and that is a blue cotton sateen left over from my Alice in Wonderland costume, and I needed that to line the sequin fabric with because it was too see-through. And here I am just hand basting that fabric to the sequin pieces, which I now sew the front and back pieces together of the sequin pieces. So I found a really cool trick here, and that is to use a leather sewing needle on your machine, and you can stitch right through those sequins. Just make sure you take it slow. So I didn't have enough fabric to cut these as one full piece, and
to be honest, I think they turned out absolutely dreadful. This one's the worst. It's got this horrible join in the bottom here, and I thought I could get away with it, but it's too ugly. Especially when I have that one there looking as good as it does. I cannot give this to the other child. It's not fair. However, I did come up with a solution. I went and brought some new fabrics, and I'm going to use those instead. There is a chance that I'll use these in between the layers of the new fabrics, but I'll show you guys when I get to that. Here we go.
New fabric time. So once again, left over from my Alice in Wonderland costume, I have this blue taffeta, which I'm going to use as the base of the skirt. I have this iridescent blue organza layer, which I'm going to layer in between that taffeta and the outer layer. And for the top layer of the skirt, once again coming in clutch, left over from my Alice in Wonderland costume, I have this blue silk organza. With all the pieces cut out, I moved on to assembling the organza layers first. Now instead of sewing just a regular straight seam down the sides here, I opted to use French seams because they add a little bit more stability to fabrics that tend to fray easily, such as the polyester iridescent organza layer. After sewing the pieces together wrong sides together first, I then trim away the excess fabric in the seam. I then fold them over so that they're now right sides together and iron that seam nice and flat. And then sew a second final seam. I then lay the silk layer over the polyester layer and then baste them together along the top edge here.
Hey, so I just wanted to jump in here and address the elephant in the room. These are my nails. I was trying to do a really cute Pikachu manicure and it's turned into an absolute disaster. They look like Pikachu got mixed into a blender and then applied to my nails, but I just wanted to show you guys that. I know they're hideous. You can tell me down below that they're hideous, but I'm aware. So just warning you, you'll probably see that in the next few shots from here on out, because I can't be bothered taking them off and redoing them again. It takes so long. Oh my gosh. just no.
It was at this point I decided I was going to use the horribly mangled sections that I'd made, because the seams actually get hidden underneath the two organza layers on top and you don't actually notice the horrible seams in it. And finally I sew up the taffeta layer. Okay, I just had this genius idea when it comes to the two inner fabrics here. So this is the taffeta layer and this is that horrible layer that you won't see in between all the layers. Anyway, I thought what I'd do is I'd sew them together along the bottom hem here, right sides together, and then I can turn it out and then baste them together along the top edge, and that'll give me a nice finished hem along the bottom, because the top edge is going to get covered by the lining on the inside of the shirt. So that's a really good way for me to cheat hemming, because I kinda hate hemming. Alright, let's see if this works. As you can see from this really great angle of me sewing here, I am sewing the two underlayers together, right sides together along the bottom edge, creating that hem. Then I turn them right ways out and baste them together along the top edge. I then baste this underlayer to the organza layer and then stitch them in place to the bottom edge of the bodice. Once again using that leather needle and taking it slow so I don't break my needle on any of the sequins. Then it's time to attach the cape to the bodice as well, and here in the centre back I'm just adding a rolled edge along the opening where the zip's going to go in. Then I pin and baste it to the bodice. Then I also baste the mesh pieces to the top as well. Then I add the lining fabric and stitch all of those fabrics together in place. With the lining fabric in, I can now sew together the shoulder seams of the mesh fabric.
Alright, here she is, just about done. All I have left to do now is to sew the sleeves on and to put a zip in the back. So how about I do that and then come back.
To do the sleeves, I first fold them in half and stitch along this edge here. Then I actually trim that seam using my overlocker to give it a nicer finish. And then the sleeves get sewn into the dress.
Alright, so the sleeves and everything are on now, and as you can see I have put the rhinestone trim along the neckline there. All that I have left to do on this costume is to hem the 2 organza layers, which I'm going to do a rolled hem on using my overlocker, and then the whole thing is done. Welcome back, the rolled hem is now on the edge, both of the costumes are finished. How about I show you what they look like? And there you have it, that is how I made the Anna and Elsa costumes using the official Simplicity pattern, and I am so happy with how they both turned out. Anna is definitely my favourite, it's just because I happen to like the design of this costume so much better than Elsa's. I've never really liked Elsa's design, I'm sorry, it's gross, it's not my favourite, but Anna's, she's got all the cute little embroidery details and the dress is fun and it's really pretty. And honestly, now having made the child-sized version, I am so tempted to make an adult-sized version for myself. What do you guys think? Should I do it? Let me know down below. Let me know which is your favourite out of these two as well, and it better be Anna. If you like what I made here today, maybe leave a like down below, maybe even consider subscribing. I do a lot of sewing, crafting and fun related things here on this channel, and I usually try and upload every week or so. With all that being said, I'll see you guys next week. Goodbye!